Today I'm sewing and sharing a lovely free dress pattern. This is the Gillian dress by Tiana's Closet. It has beautiful ruching down the center front, elasticated sleeves, and a zipper in the back. This would make a gorgeous cocktail dress, party dress, or a New Year's dress. I've left a link for you below so that you can check out the pattern, grab a copy, and sew it along with me. Let's get started. Apply interfacing to your front neck facing and your back neck facings. We're going to start gathering our front bodice piece. At the top edge of the curve on your pattern piece, you have a notch indicating where to start your gathering. You'll gather from this point on your fabric all the way to this subtle corner on your pattern piece, right at the top point of where you cut your fabric on the fold. So we will be gathering between these two notches. I'm going to take my material to my sewing machine and start my gathering stitches here at this top notch, using the longest stitch on my machine and about a 3/8 inch seam allowance from the notch to the bottom of the V. Make sure to leave thread tails on either end so that you have threads to pull for gathering. I've gone ahead and pulled the gathering stitches on one side of the dress until the curve of that front bodice became a straight line. Now I'm going to gather the bodice on the other side until it also is a straight line. Now that I've gathered both sides of my center front, and the gathers are distributed evenly on both sides and match up in length from notch to notch, I'm going to fold my front bodice in half, right sides together, and I'm going to pin in place from the notch to the neckline. And now I'm ready to sew these sides of the center front together with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and then I'm going to serge my seams to finish. Keep in mind that as you're sewing with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, you'll be sewing slightly beyond your gathering and allowing your stitching to gradually taper until you naturally reach the edge of the fabric. I'm going to start sewing the darts into both of my back bodice pieces. I've transferred my dart onto the wrong side of the fabric using a tracing wheel and tracing paper. And now I'm going to fold this dart in half and pin through one dart leg and out the other. Now that I've pinned my darts for both of my back bodice pieces, I'm ready to sew them in place from the tip of my dart all the way down to the opposite tip, leaving thread tails on either end so that I could tie both ends in knots. And do the same thing for the other dart. Now place your front and back pieces right sides together and pin your shoulder seams and side seams. And do this on both sides. Go to your machine and sew both shoulder seams and both side seams with a 1/2 inch seam allowance and serge your seams to finish. To prepare the hem of my sleeve, I've taken the sleeve to the ironing board and pressed up the raw edge to the wrong side by 1/4 inch, and then pressed it up to the wrong side an additional 3/4 inch. I've done this for both sleeves. It's easier to press the sleeve hem now before the side seams are sewn. So with those pressed edges laying out flat for now, fold your sleeve in half, right sides together, and pin that side seam. Do this for both sleeves and then sew from the underarm seam to the raw edge with a 1/2 inch seam allowance and serge your seams to finish. I'm going to fold up my hem along those memory creases that I pressed earlier, with that 1/4 inch raw portion tucked under, and pin in place all the way around. Now that I've folded and pinned my hems on both sleeves, I'm going to take them to my machine and edge stitch close to this inner upper fold all the way around both sleeves, leaving about a 2 inch gap in my stitching for inserting my elastic. I'm using 1/2 inch wide elastic for the bottom of my sleeves. I'm going to cut my elastic to a length that fits comfortably right below my elbow where the end of my sleeve is going to sit. I'm going to add a 1/2 inch of length to either side of that measurement for when I overlap and sew those elastic pieces together. Attaching a safety pin to one end of my elastic, I'm going to draw it through the sleeve, through the opening that I left in my casing. And once I've pulled it through to the other side, I'm going to overlap both ends of the elastic by about 1/2 inch and then zigzag stitch back and forth to secure. And once you've sewn the ends together, you can pull your elastic to the inside and sew that opening closed following the original stitching line. Now we're ready to place the sleeves into the armholes. Match your notches to make sure that you're attaching the correct sleeve to the correct side of the bodice. Place the material at the top of the sleeve and the armhole right sides together and pin in place all the way around, matching your underarm seams and your notches. Sew around your armhole with a 1/2 inch seam allowance and serge your seams to finish, and repeat these steps to attach the other sleeve to the other armhole. Place your front and back facings right sides together and pin your shoulder seams. Sew these seams with a 1/2 inch seam allowance and press your seams open. Now you want to finish the outside rounded edges of the facing. You can use a serger to do this, zigzag stitch, or you could do a tiny rolled hem all the way around. Attach the facing to the neckline right sides together, matching the center front of your facing to the center front of your bodice and pin in place, and matching the shoulder seams and the back edges of the dress. Now go to your sewing machine and sew the facing to your dress with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Trim this seam allowance by about half. I'm also going to clip into the curves of the neckline so that it folds nice and smoothly to the other side. Just making small clips into the remaining seam allowance, careful not to cut into my stitching. I'm also going to understitch the facing. I'm going to press this facing up and over that seam allowance. And then I'm going to sew this seam allowance to the facing all the way around, about 1/8 of an inch away from the original stitching line. Now press that facing right along that seam to the inside of the garment. Using a needle and thread, I'm going to sew the facing to the seam allowances at the shoulder seams, making sure that the shoulder seam of your facing aligns perfectly with the shoulder seam of your dress. Use a needle and thread to catch a tiny piece of your seam allowance, as well as the edge of your facing. Stay stitch those in place. Careful not to sew through the outside of your dress so the stitches are invisible on the outside. Do this stitching at both of your shoulder seams, and additionally you can do it at the bottom of your center front seam as well. I'm ready to start applying my zipper to the back of my dress. To find out how long of a zipper you need, I would recommend pinning together the back of your dress from about halfway to the bottom hem, and then trying the dress on to see how much clearance you need back here, how long you need your zipper to be. I'm going to be using an invisible zipper, and I just used the longest one I had in my stash, which is 18 inches long. I'm going to take this to my ironing board and press open the coils of the invisible zipper so that they open up and lay flat. I'm also going to serge both of the back edges of the back of my dress, making sure that the facing is opened out and starting at the serged edge of my facing all the way down to the bottom of my dress. Do this for both sides. I'm going to place the left side of my zipper tape with the left back side of my dress. And I'm going to place the top zipper stop about 1/8 of an inch below the facing seam and start pinning in place. My zipper tape is 1/2 of an inch wide from the edge of the zipper tape to the teeth. And because my seam allowance is 1/2 an inch, I'm just placing the edge of my zipper tape right along the edge of that seam. And now changing my machine foot to a zipper foot, I'm going to sew as close as I can get to those zipper teeth from the top to the bottom of the zipper. And now that that side of my zipper is installed, I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. I'm going to place the right side of my zipper right sides together with the other side of my dress, placing it about 1/8 of an inch away from the seam line and pinning in place. Take this side of your dress to your sewing machine and using your zipper foot again, stitch close to the teeth all the way from the top of the zipper to the bottom. Now that our zipper is fully installed, we can finish off the neckline. I'm going to fold this top center edge of my facing to the inside by 1/2 inch. I'm going to take the top of my zipper tape, fold it back at an angle. So fold down this facing right along that seam line, sandwiching your zipper in between and pin in place. And then you have a couple options here. You could use a needle and thread to slip stitch the edge of your facing to the zipper tape, and that way you can ensure that your stitches will not be visible from the outside of the garment. But because my thread is a perfect match to my material, I'm just going to top stitch right along the edge of the facing, and it will be a very inconspicuous stitching line on the outside of my garment. So go ahead and choose the way that you want to attach the edge of the facing to the zipper tape, and do this for both sides of your center back. And now with both of my back pieces right sides together, I'm going to pin from the bottom of the zipper to the bottom of the dress. Move that bottom zipper tape out of the way so that you can start your stitching as close as you can to the end of that zipper stitching. And then you can continue stitching this seam, beginning your stitching right where your stitching ended for the zipper, down to the end with your 1/2 inch seam allowance. To get your stitching precisely where it needs to be to match the end of your zipper stitching, you may need to start out with your zipper foot for about 6 or 7 stitches and then switch to your regular foot to continue down with that 1/2 inch seam allowance. This will allow you to get nice and close to that original stitching and avoid the zipper teeth that are still in this area. Now the final step is to hem the bottom of the dress. I've taken the dress to the ironing board and pressed up the bottom raw edge to the wrong side by 1/4 inch, and then I pressed it once more to the wrong side by 1 inch. Now I'm going to take it to my sewing machine and edge stitch close to this top fold all the way around. Then you'll be all done with your dress. Thank you for watching this sew along. Make sure you check out my other videos for more great sewing inspiration, and I'll see you in the next video.